Hi, everyone, and welcome to Vision to Value. This is our new podcast where we're going to be pulling back the curtain on how technology is planned, purchased, and implemented in state and local health and human services agencies. This is our first of hopefully more podcasts where we'll be talking about some of the challenges associated with these large scale implementations and having some really candid conversations. We want this to be really authentic. We are hoping that you'll walk away with some actionable insights, maybe some new strategies for how you approach health and human services transformation. My name is Carole Hussey, and I am the president and founder of Evolve Strategy Group. And I've been working in health and human services around the country for about 25 years, primarily in technology and transformation work on the management consulting side of the house. And I have with me today my industry colleague and friend, Tony Mathews. And Tony, I'll let you say a little bit about yourself.
Thank you, Carole. This is really exciting. My name's Tony Mathews. I used to be the Deputy Commissioner and Chief Operating Officer for the Tennessee Department of Human Services. So with 15 years of state government experience, I've seen a lot of successes and failures, especially as it relates to technology and modernization. So I think this whole forum for talking about what succeeds, what fails, and the whys behind both of those is going to be really critical to folks that are either in the middle of an engagement like this or considering taking on this kind of a task. So I'm glad to be here.
Thanks, Tony. Yeah, so Tony and I met a couple of years ago. We were working on engagement with another company that he was with at the time, and we reconnected. And we've been having some like kind of soapbox conversations where we could I feel like we could talk all day long. And we're talking, and Tony's like, "I bet other people are having these same conversations." And I said, "We should do a podcast." And Tony was like, "I'm all in. I'm all in. Let's do it." And we've done this in pretty short order. So here we are today with our first episode, and we're calling this episode the Transformation Gamble, and why health and human services projects succeed or why they fail. And we called it that because, these projects, these very large scale projects are really a gamble, right? High risk, potentially high reward. And so we really wanted to kind of use this episode to sort of lay the groundwork for some of those future episodes where we're going to dig really deep, because there's no quick hit answer to why something succeeds and something else fails, right? There's many layers of complexity and stakeholders and regulatory things and fiscal things and all that stuff. So we will dig deep in the future on each of those topics and more. But today we're going to kind of talk about why state HHS technologies face the pitfalls. What are some of the pitfalls they face? And then the one thing I was asking Tony about in one of our previous conversations was, what really is even success and failure? What does that mean to different people? Because you could certainly implement something on time and on budget and still not satisfy some of your, project goals. And so how do we measure success and failure? And then we also want to talk about things like I mentioned funding, procurement, planning, organizational change management is so huge, right? And sometimes underestimated or underfunded. So we'll talk a little bit about that. But the one thing that you'll probably hear Tony talk about today, and I loved when he said this to me, is that we must have a transformation mindset, not just a modernization mindset. And we'll talk a lot about what that is. So without further ado, I'm going to kind of just lob some questions at you, Tony. We'll talk, about them just like we do on all of our other phone calls. But let's just start with, why technology is so critical to health and human services organizations and the opportunities that come with these types of transformation projects.
Well, I mean, I think as most people that might be watching know, there's a lot of different stakeholders, right? That technology touches, especially in the HHS realm, right? You've got, whether it's the citizens, right, that are the primary focus. You've also got the employees as a stakeholder. The easier it is for employees to work within the system and to sort of process applications and do eligibility determination and income verification, the easier that is, the more efficient they're going to be, the more motivated they're going to be, the more effective they're going to be, more helpful. And it really does sort of translate to the experience that the customer has if the employee feels like they have the tools to be as effective as possible. Not only that, but you've got a lot of reporting requirements in this arena. And anybody who's ever been audited, as we all have, um, it can take you 3 weeks to try to compile some audit related information, or it can take you 3 hours, right? Depending on your systems. That, in addition to, the real challenge I think with a lot of state and local governments is with a lot of the workforce sort of aging out of it, the people you have, the sort of centers of knowledge that you have for the old systems are starting to retire, right? And as those legacy systems really get very legacy, you've got fewer and fewer people that can help you sort of update those, amend those. And so I think modernization is critical to sort of alleviating that necessity to have one or two key people on the team at all times, or the whole system's in jeopardy.
Hmm. Yeah, even finding consultants to help you, right,
Oh,
with some of those older technologies is very difficult as well. And then the cost when you do find those unicorns is really high. Yeah, I mean
Yeah,
it is a
yeah,
challenge.
and a lot of state systems today are so highly customized that any release that happens, it breaks so many things. It might fix 80 things, but it might break 20 because
Hmm.
it's so highly customized and patched that the updates that you get, the new releases that come out, actually break almost as many things, it feels like, as they fix. And so
Yeah,
I think that's another element of this that you got to take into account.
yeah, yeah, for sure. And when we think about, you know, transformation, we don't want to discount the fact that we know some states are dealing with highly antiquated technology. And so, yes, we want transformation from a business perspective, but we also need modernization from a technology perspective, just because
Right.
many of these technologies, they aren't even supported any longer. And so at some point, you do have to get off of those old platforms and onto something new, even if it means just replacing your system in parity without actually transforming your business. Sometimes that is your primary goal, right?
No, that's exactly right. And that really dovetails into organizational change management, right? You don't just change your technology. You've got to realize that the staff that you hired 20 years ago, the analogy I like to use is, you sort of hired soccer players, right? A very, sort of analog process, a lot of paper, a lot of face-to-face interactions. 20 years later, you're not playing soccer anymore, right? We're playing baseball. And you've got to realize that the new technology has a different skill set requirement, right? And a different aptitude that employees have. And some soccer players can make that transition to playing baseball, and some can't, and some don't want to. And so I
Right.
think OCM is a big part of your whole technological advancement if you're doing it very deliberately.
Hmm. Yeah, and we often talk about OCM from the perspective of end users, like our frontline workers or even our clients, but we don't often talk about OCM for the technology department and
Right.
the big impact on them, right? And so, that's something I think we could dive into as well. Okay, so one of the things we kind of mentioned at the beginning is sort of this notion of what is success and failure, and what sort of are the stakes of success and failure. And so some of we talked a little bit about workforce and employee morale and that sort of thing, but certainly there's the external facing facets as well, right? Like wasted taxpayer dollars or compliance and risk associated with some of those regulatory channels, and um, diminished trust just in general, including like with your legislature. So talk a little bit, Tony, what's your perspective on that in terms of the stakes of success and failure?
Yeah, I think, the obvious ones as far as trust with the public and with your employees, I think is important. But I do think that the part with the legislature, I think some people can overlook. Um, most agencies, or if not all agencies, have to go to the legislature or some entity there within, right? In order to get the funding and sort of make the argument for why they need the investment that they do to upgrade these systems. And there's usually a sell, right? You're telling them this is what's lacking, this is what needs to be improved, this is how it's going to positively affect your constituents. And when you don't plan appropriately, or you don't think this through from beginning to end, and you have a failure, that sort of credibility and that political capital that you've spent with the legislature is very hard to get back. You spend it much faster than you earn it. And so once they've given you millions of dollars for something and it crashes and burns, or it's a fraction of what the expectation was, then all of a sudden you're in a deficit with them. And now
Hmm.
you're having to sort of explain what went wrong, why it went wrong, and how it's not going to go wrong in the future. And so now you have zero wiggle room and zero grace with the legislature because they trusted you once, they felt like you didn't deliver, and so now you've got to beg forgiveness and hope that it goes perfectly the second time, or you've lost all credibility, and that's something that's detrimental to everyone involved, right?
Yeah, for sure. And some states unfortunately have a history of, challenges, and so they come at it already at a deficit, right? And
Yeah.
so you're just trying to dig out of that historical hole. I know when you're a whole new leadership team, for example, coming into place in a state, and you've got you inherited some of that baggage, and you're just trying to get some quick wins. It's really important to be able to build that credibility quickly.
Yeah, and I think the other piece of that too is your federal partner, right? Because they're footing the bill for a good piece of this.
Yeah.
It's not just the state dollars. And so, all these big projects have an IV&V vendor because the feds want to make sure that you're doing what you're supposed to, ethically and correctly. But when you have a failure, you lose face with the feds too. And now you've got to
Hmm.
document even more going forward because they don't want to get burned again either.
Yeah.
So there's a lot at stake.
Yeah, for sure. So, with all of that at stake, let's talk a little bit then about, what drives project success. And, if that's the goal, we want to make sure that we're getting to this place of success where we've met our project goals, right? We delivered on time, on budget, those sort
Mhm.
of things, but also that, we're improving our program, we're improving our operations, we've got happier employees. And so what are the things that we should be doing to make sure that that's where we're heading?
It's all the things I think that intuitively leaders know, but that in practice we don't always take the time to execute on. It's planning the work before you work the plan, right? It's thinking it through from beginning to end. That includes communication with staff. That includes collecting feedback from all the stakeholders, right? And what their perspectives are. I mean, that includes, like I talked about, staffing and making sure you've got the right butts in the right seats, so to speak. A big part of success that I've been lucky enough to be involved with in Tennessee DHS was we had a very cohesive group between executive leadership, the operational and programmatic leadership, and then the IT folks.
Mhm.
And I think if you don't have a cohesive sort of vision and good communication, every pulling in the same direction to where they can support each other's sort of priorities, I think that's when things can get a little sideways. You
Mhm.
can't just be talking to the technical people without input from the program people, or vice versa.
Mhm.
But the challenge, I think, a lot of times, especially with the program folks, is they've got day jobs, right?
Yeah.
And so I think having executive leadership that's willing to take some of the burden, some of the expectations off of the SMEs, right? The subject matter experts that you're going to need to be successful, and sort of give them some grace from their day-to-day work so they can engage in this transformational effort, right? Because
Mhm.
if you don't, then it's just one more task on top of everything else that they're doing, and they really can't put their real, thought and effort into making this go as smoothly as possible if they're doing what feels like two jobs at the same time.
Right.
So there's
For sure.
there's a lot of elements to that.
Yeah. And, some of what you talked about are the things that happen from the point of project kickoff to the point of implementing something. But you and I have also spent a lot of time talking about all those things that happen before the RFP even hits the street, right? And you talked about having a shared vision, right? And
Yeah.
measurable outcomes and, like all those things that really drive scope, that drive timeline, that drive the measurable outcomes. And so, can we talk a little bit about that aspect, that pre kickoff day activities, and what we should be doing in that kind of time frame to prevent these failures from happening downstream?
Yeah, that's exactly right. A lot of the work that you should be doing to make sure that you understand, what's working, right? What needs to be improved, where the gaps are, what success looks like to you, right? What positive outcomes look like. A lot of the work that needs to be done there, you're going to be able to leverage when you're filling out your federal paperwork, right, to get the funding approved, or you're testifying in front of a legislative committee as to why you need the state dollars to match the federal dollars. So a lot of that effort, that time and effort, if you can stop long enough to get the stakeholders involved to sort of talk through those things and document those, that's going to pay dividends down the road because you're going to need that over and over. I think if you just sort of pencil whip it, as they say, and you just fill out the minimum to get through the federal requirements, and you're not thoughtful about it, and you don't bring everybody to the table that needs to be at the table, then you're going to have to go through it again when you get ready to present to the legislature. You have to do it again in a different form when you get ready to present it to your staff. So a lot of that sort of strategic outcome development, sort of big picture stuff is really important to sort of take some dedicated time away from, you know, your desk with your day-to-day stuff and think that through and document it. And that's going to pay dividends when you get to leverage that going down the road.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
That
and
applies to procurement too, Carol. You have to think about how you want
yeah,
to procure as well, and that's a whole nother conversation.
yeah. And I used to think, oh, business should lead and, whatever. But to your point, it needs to be this cohesive team of people working together from the front. Because like the other thing I've seen too is like in a few instances where, the secretary or deputy secretary or in some cases the governor's office will say, we're going to get this done in 2 years. And then they'll put out an RFP that has scope that can't be done in 2 years.
Right.
And so then we talk about, okay, are we extending the timeline or are we changing the scope? Well, no, we can't because the governor's office said this is going to get done in 2 years, so it has to get done in 2 years. So it's like sometimes you can only throw so many people in the ditch, right? We getting back to like reasonable scope, reasonable timelines, understanding the budget implications. I've seen a couple of RFPs come out, and it takes a lot, as you now, Tony, you've been on both sides of the fence, but a lot of time and effort goes into building a proposal. And so I've seen a couple of RFPs that have come out over the years. And when the vendors responded with their pricing, the agencies were surprised by how expensive some things are. And so having a sense of what can I get for my budget becomes very important, right? You can't go buy a Cadillac if you're living on a Pinto budget or whatever. I'm dating myself now. But Tony's great with analogies and things, so I'm trying to keep up. But yeah, so I think that collaboration, getting back to that, like how do you know what scope I can get for what amount of money and what timeline? That requires input from a lot of people, and sometimes your RFIs and other things can help guide some of that.
Yeah, and a lot of state agencies are scared, I think, to they're either afraid to talk to private industry because they're afraid that it's going to limit who can bid on projects, or it's going to look like they prefer one versus the other. Um, and and honestly, a lot of a lot of private vendors will sort of oversell whatever problem you have, that they'll try to convince you that they have the solution. But really, a good rapport with the industry, I think, the states that engage in the different industry, players, to pick their brain on best practices and where things have succeeded or failed in other parts of the country. Seem to be more informed when they get ready to do their RFP.
Mhm.
A lot of states will do an RFI to try to gain some of that information. But I think having that rapport and sort of understanding sort of what you need to be looking for or asking for or how will help gauge sort of what you can get for your buck. But a
Mhm.
lot of times, I think when just program or just IT drive the procurement, I think that's when you start having problems because
Yeah.
program doesn't understand that the technological part as much and the support it takes to keep these things up and running once you stand them up. And
Mhm.
IT always doesn't always appreciate the nuances of working within that system and what some of the challenges will be for the frontline workers that are going to have to leverage that technology. So I
Mhm.
do think it's got to be a concerted effort, or you're less likely to be successful.
Yeah. Yeah, I definitely agree with that. And then, the other stakeholder, of course, are the people who we're serving
Right.
ultimately, right? I mean, so how are you going about getting, resident or citizen experience, and using that to inform your transformation? Because I will say too, and I believe this, that it, you can solve a lot of your operational efficiency issues and your workforce issues by providing capabilities to your citizens, your clients. You think about sending in forms and pieces of paper, and somebody's got to touch it and scan it or do something with it. And whereas there are a lot of things that if we automated it appropriately, it would significantly reduce the load on our internal workers. It would allow services to be delivered more quickly and potentially effectively. Um, so there's a lot we can do if we think about that citizen experience and invite them to help co-design or inform design of our solutions in a way that they will welcome that. They got quite a taste of it post COVID when states had to
Yeah.
automate. Many of us weren't ready for that, but it was like, all right, here we go. And when you start giving people a little bit of capability, they often want more. And I think sometimes I still hear people say, "Oh, a lot of our clients don't have computers." Nope, they don't have computers, but almost all of them have
Uh,
smartphones, right? And they can't make it to the office downtown because they can't get off work, but they could use a smartphone app, in the afternoon. And these are just very simple examples, of course, but there's a lot we can do for the recipients of these really important programs that is going to meet them where they are, serve them better, and also bring great value to the agency.
Well, so when we were going through our modernization process, we quickly realized we weren't just modernizing our systems, right? We were transforming the way we did business. And part of that was we thought about sort of that, whatever door you come in, right? You fill out an application, you fill out some basic information. We should be able to direct you to the other programs we have that you may qualify or need, right? And doing that and sort of that having that conversation about transforming the way we do business with new technology, we realized that a lot of times in human services, you have to prove your income over and over and over to show you qualify for each program. And that can be frustrating, especially if you're doing it on your iPhone, where you're having to put in your kids' names and date of birth and your income and all of this, 20 times for 20 different programs. And so just the thought of you put it all in once, and when you click the box for you want to be considered for this other program, it's going to pre-populate all the information you've already provided. I mean, you can get that today when you log on to Amazon. It
Yeah.
already knows your mailing address, your billing address. You click the box to make sure that they're the same,
Yeah.
and then away you go. And I think the expectation from the public now is much higher than it was
Oh, yeah.
when these legacy systems started. So little things like that not only help the consumer, but like I mentioned earlier, it helps the employee not have to take that hard copy information and read the writing and put it into the system. It's already in the system
Mhm.
because the citizen put it in themselves.
Yeah. Yeah. And, that automation, whether it's AI or whatever, we'll probably spend a whole topic or two or three on AI. But just the suggestion of other things. Like I might not know other things that I'm eligible for. I might not know what all these programs
So,
are. But if I put all of my information in and you can suggest to me that there are these other things out there. Think about this with workforce a lot, like with SNAP, where some states have workforce requirements, probably more are going to have workforce requirements. Um, what if, rather than just checking to make sure I got a job that might not have a career path or a livable salary, what if I were given information about vocational courses that I could take for free, where I would also have childcare or community college courses. So there's lots of applicable. We all know about social determinants of health. We all know about economic mobility. And so there are definitely ways we can leverage technology to really help better support people with. There's so many services and things that can be available to people, but the truth is they may not know they exist. And so if we can
well,
help
yeah.
them that way, that would be so impactful.
Well, you mentioned we could have two or three of these episodes on just AI, but I do want to put sort of a teaser out there that AI isn't a magic bullet where you just buy it and it works. AI is only as good as the data that feeds it. And
Yeah.
so I think that one of the sort of awakening a lot of state departments and local governments are going to have is you got to get your data cleaned up before you can really launch a successful, capable AI function. And so
Hmm.
that's a whole nother episode all by itself. But I think there's a lot of misunderstanding about what AI is,
Yeah.
because you hear about it and you've seen some examples of how landing what goes in, what the foundation is to make it effective. And
Hmm.
I think that's sort of an awakening that a lot of state and local governments are going to have,
Yeah.
understanding you got to do the heavy lifting on the front end to make the AI work effectively.
Right. And this is no, what I'm about to say is not a smack against the industry that we're both so dedicated to, but I mean the truth of the matter is a lot of agencies aren't even using current technologies effectively or at all in some cases. So even forgetting about Gen AI, right? Like, mobile solutions and chat bots and things that are already available, proven, and can be implemented very quickly. Like some agencies haven't even, been able to get those things in place yet, and they can have really big impacts. So I would say, AI is very polarizing. There's a lot to be figured out. Data, house needs to be in order, as Tony mentioned, but also I just think there are a lot of other things that you could do now that are of lower risk and bigger reward, which is our topic today, right? High risk, high reward, but
Yeah. Well,
some
and
progress.
I think that goes back to the point of that you and I have talked about previously about you can't just apply modern technology to legacy processes. And I think the states that you're mentioning that are probably struggling with current technology is because they haven't really rethought their processes to leverage that technology. They're just trying to do everything the way they've always done it, only using new tech.
Yeah,
And I think those are the states that are probably struggling the most.
yeah. Well, and thinking about that, right? Like, I mean, even if you look at CWIS, right, which is one of the big movements at the moment in HHS,
Mhm.
and there were some very early adopters who just were like, "Yep, sign me up, I'm going to do it." And then you've had some real laggers, right? They're not moving forward, and there's a lot of reasons for that, right? Like, so what are the reasons that someone might not be so inclined to take this risk? They're like, no, thanks. I can't go there.
Well, I mean, there's a lot of reasons. One, they may not have that cohesive, sort of relationships that we talked about for success, right? The chief executive may not be supporting the technology, the IT folks, and so they just don't play nice in the sandbox. There's the fear of asking for money. I mean, some states' budgets are a lot tighter than others. Some are on 2-year cycles. And so it's tricky sort of timing when when you make your play for additional funding. Um, and some are just intimidated. I think that as we talk more about what it takes to be successful, it feels overwhelming. It's hard
Yeah,
enough to get the money, and the good news is we got the money. Now you're telling me I need to be measuring outcomes and getting the key stakeholders all on the same page. Like, is that even possible?
right.
And getting input from my staff and what they need without a degradation of the quality of the work that they're doing day to day. Like, there are a lot of obstacles. And if you only see those, sort of the running back in football that only sees the 11 guys that are trying to tackle him, just wants to, lay down, take a knee. You've got to have the mindset of there's a way through this. I just have to have sort of the strength and the motivation to figure out what that path is to get to where I'm going.
Yeah,
And
for sure.
yeah, otherwise, all you see is obstacles and it's overwhelming.
Hmm. And I think I would say to some of those folks that are a little more conservative, a little more risk averse, is there are ways to do this incrementally. You
Mm.
do not have to do big bang implementation of $100 or $80 million project. You're already spending whatever you're spending, right? Let's say you're spending 10, 15 million a year to maintain your 30-year-old system. What can you do with that 10 to 20 million or whatever it is that in the next year or two to advance your enterprise and to provide value to your program partners? There are much, we sometimes refer to this incremental modernization strategy and
Mhm.
getting a lower risk roadmap and
Right.
implement that in a very methodical way. There are ways to do this, and I will say this to those folks too. Um, you have to really get an independent, objective advisor to help you if you want outside help, if you're uncomfortable doing this yourself. There are people, not to toot our own horns, but like Tony and I, who, we aren't, working for a big company. We've been through it a time or two. And, whoever you choose, just like you want to understand what all of your options are, what are the pros and cons. When you talk about the cons, you have to think about, those fiscal implications, looking at where your biggest problem areas are from a programmatic perspective and how you order the various increments of your roadmap. Tony and I had a call last week or week before, and I was saying I think a lot of these roadmaps are backwards, right? Like there are things I would flip around if I were doing an incremental modernization approach. It would look very different than if I were doing a big bang. And data was right up front there. Mobile was right up front there. There's some other things that I would certainly do differently. But you have options. That's the point here. You have options. No need to rush right into putting out an RFP for, an SI without exploring those options.
Yeah, and the only thing I would add to that, Kara, I mean, that's exactly right. The only thing I would add to that is, most states have a central IT element, right? Each department's got their own IT shop, and then you've got sort of a central IT as well. And a lot of times, those centralized IT shops are supporting all the different systems in every department across the state. And so
Mm-hmm.
I would, if you're going to try to be incremental and you're going to try to sort of piecemeal it, I definitely think engaging, having a great relationship with that central IT shop and knowing what they're supporting other places, whether it's a case management system or, an eligibility system that they're using somewhere else. Maybe there's a way to leverage successes that they've had without it
Mm-hmm.
costing you an arm and a leg, standing up a whole new, different solution yourself. And
Yeah.
I don't know that we do a lot of that in state government where we try to leverage what's already being supported somewhere else in state government and see if it could work for us without
Mm-hmm.
us having to do sort of a major lift and a whole new system implementation.
Yeah. And I think the other thing I would say about that is you don't have to take the whole thing lock, stock, and barrel, right? Like
Yeah.
if let's just say you have a platform, and I won't, name any because I don't want to leave anybody out, but let's say you have a platform that you've already implemented on your Medicaid side of the house and you want to leverage that over in child welfare or child support, have at it. But
Yeah.
there is some economy of scale associated with
Yes.
that. And also if you're looking to bring maintenance and operations in-house, much easier to hire for one skill set versus two or three or four. But the one thing I will say is a lot of times those enterprise platforms, they aren't necessarily the end all be all for everything you need it to do. So use it where it makes sense to use it. And if there's a COTS product that you want to use for some component of that, right? We're all supposed to be building these things modularly. There are some great purpose-built COTS products on the market. You don't want to have a full best of breed model where everything's connecting together, but if there are a few modules that you'd like to, use an off-the-shelf product for because it's purpose-built for child welfare, you can do that, right? There are ways to integrate those other capabilities on the platform. Building out a platform to do some of these things is reinventing the wheel in some cases. So just, bear in mind that it doesn't have to be all one way or all the other. You can, pick and choose where it makes sense to do so.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And I, as another tease for another episode, I think there's a whole element of how you go about selecting, vendors or partners to work with. There's some things that you just want A, B, C, and that's it. And just please do these three things in 6 months and we'll pay you and we're done. There are other things that you're going to want to do where you want a partner. You don't want somebody who's just going to do exactly what you tell them because you might have it wrong and they know it. Uh, but if you've only hired a vendor versus a partner that are only going to do what they're told, that's what you're going to get. And so there's some tasks and some modular pieces you only need a vendor, right? You know exactly what you want. You know exactly what the requirements are. It's cut and dry. It's very easy. There are other elements of a modernization project where you need a partner. You need somebody that's willing to tell you, we can do that, but just so you know, here are the implications if you decide to go that route. And that's, I mean, that's priceless. And
Yeah.
and a lot of that has to do with procurement, and we can talk about that in another episode.
And also why executive level engagement is so important, right? Because if I ask you to do something and you say, we can do that, but here are the implications, or here's another option, like you need people that can make those decisions involved in the project, because that's another area where things get really hung up is, the day-to-day people on the project aren't always the ones empowered to make those really important decisions. And so what does that change management process look like? And I know that's something we want to talk about in a future episode as well. So with that, I think we'll kind of start to wrap up here a little bit. We talked about a few things that we're gonna, get into in future episodes, right? Procurement, navigating funding and politics and turnover and, all of those fun things. Building successful partnerships. OCM is something that comes up in every single conversation Tony and I have, so we'll definitely be mentioning that. And then, the problem with like a solution first mindset versus really sort of defining what you need. But Tony, what are your final takeaways from our first session together?
This is great. This is a lot more fun than I thought it would be. I guess one of my takeaways would be just to let folks know that this is hard. If it was easy, anybody could do it. It's hard, but it's meaningful, and I think that's the nature of the work in health and human services. Is it's not easy. It's challenging, but if you know what you're trying to accomplish and you've got people with the right mindset, you can absolutely get there. It's doable. Now, it may not be doable to the extent you want it to be in the time you want it to, but that's just part of sort of level setting on realistic expectations and what's possible with the time and the money and the resources we have available to us. But yeah, it's just like anything else in HHS. It's hard, but it's possible. And I tell you, it's really rewarding when you get it done and you do it right. The nice part about these types of exercises is, you can't let perfection get in the way of good. If you only get 90% of the way toward where you're trying to go, you've really made a difference in people's lives, whether it's the citizen, the taxpayer, or your employees. 90% toward your very ambitious goal is so much better than when you started.
Yeah. Yeah, I love that. It's so important to remember that, and that kind of gets back to the early part of our episode of what is success and what is failure, right? And so,
Yeah.
any progress is good progress, and we all need to remember that and celebrate it, right? Because sometimes it's just so easy to look at where things didn't go perfectly, and where we can do better, which we should do, but we should also celebrate our accomplishments and continue to move that ball forward. Um, so, we'll be bringing some friends to future episodes, so you won't want to miss that. There's a big network of people like Tony and myself who are out here kind of doing our own thing, who care a lot and want to see everyone be successful. And so we're gonna, we have a plan to bring some of our friends to talk about some of their experiences as well. And we hope that you enjoyed this first episode of Vision to Value. We're really looking forward to coming together again and really tackling some of the hard truths, right? Some of these conversations are going to be tough, but we want to really, hopefully, inform change and help the industry that we care about improve. So we look forward to seeing all of you on our next episode. And thanks so much for sticking with us and listening to our conversation today. Thank you.
Till later.